Hey everyone, this is the Spoon Dude back with another Spider-Man action figure review. This time we'll be taking a look at the Hasbro Marvel Legends Renew Your Vow 2-pack Spider-Man figure, released as part of the Beyond Amazing 60th Anniversary of Spider-Man set of Marvel Legends. This video will mainly focus on the Spider-Man figure, as that's what I have the most to say about, and will frankly spend too long talking about just that one figure. But I will briefly discuss the Spinneret, aka Mary Jane figure, towards the end of this video, since this is a 2-pack and the value of the set can't be separated from the quality of both figures. The set retails for $55.99, but the final cost will obviously differ depending on shipping, taxes, and where you're buying from. We'll discuss Spider-Man's scale, accessories, aesthetics, quality control, articulation, both on the figure's own and in comparison to the previous version of this figure that Hasbro put out. This figure is largely a derivation of the Spider-Man Retro Carded Series figure that Hasbro put out about 2 years ago, and I happened to review back then as well. So as such, this figure is on more or less the same style body and is the same size. So talking about scale, you can see he's shorter than a beefier Marvel Legends like Captain America, but will still be taller than most of Marvel women like the MJ that he's included with. This body, based on the Retro Spidey, which in and of itself is based on the Sunfire / Spider-Man 2099 body, it's a bulkier body than Hasbro's Pizza Spider-Man body mold that was the previous standard for most of their Spider-Man. Here we have a slightly more muscular, more adult-looking Spider-Man than you might find with those Pizza Spider-Man figures. Accessory-wise, the Spider-Man comes packed with 3 sets of hands, including the ones on the figure, and an alternate head. The hands aren't anything new. Sculpt-wise, they're identical to the set of the hands of the Pizza Spider-Man that we got all those years ago. But it is nice that we get the full set here. Hasbro have been real weird about excluding certain hands on certain Spider-Man figures. Specifically, the open wall-crawling hands have been absent on a lot of Spider-Man figures for seemingly no reason, I guess other than just saving a few cents on Hasbro's part. That applies to that retro-carded Spider-Man that I'm going to keep bringing up in this video. That figure only came with the fists and the web-shooting hands, and it was really frustrating not having the wall-crawling hands for that figure. And I think it's nice that they're finally included here. I don't want to celebrate their inclusion here too much because I really feel that it should be standard that a superposable Spider-Man come with these hands. Spider-Man needs to be able to punch, he needs to be able to web shoot, and he needs to be able to wall crawl. So while it's nice that they come with this figure, I don't want to give Hasbro too much credit for doing what's arguably the bare essential for a Spider-Man set of hands. You also get an unmasked head. This is nice, though, like the hands, it's not exactly a new accessory. This is a repaint of a head that's come out before. I've never bought any of those previous Spider-Man figures that had this head, so it's new to me. And something else that's new with it is at least the new paint job. It's redecoed this time with that digital quote-unquote photoreal style printing, which adds a lot more detail. Features like his eyebrows and the pupils are a lot softer because of that kind of pixelation. And it gives a lot more life to the head sculpt and makes it a little bit less cartoony. Not that the cartoony style, doesn't fit for a comic book style Peter Parker head, but I'm just saying I prefer this kind of more detailed, softer style paint job for these heads. And I think it's a really nice head as well. The sculpt of this Peter Parker, it really is one of Hasbro's best comic Peter heads, though he kind of has DreamWorks face. And I really like the way it sits on this body specifically. Or I think originally it was intended for the Pizza Spider-Man body, but when you do a head swap, it really seems big on that body, whereas it really fits here. Anyways, looking at this body now, I've already said that this figure is derived from the Retro Card Spider-Man, but it is not a straight-up repaint with like a new head. Past that new head, he's got updated limbs that have been treated with the much bragged about pinless quote-unquote tech, and new feet with much needed toe articulation. We'll get to that part later. So let's talk about the new limbs, the pinless tech. Why all the hoopla about the pinless elbows and knees?
It sounds like a lot of... Hoopla! Sounds like a... Hoopla! Hoopla! Sounds like a lot of hoopla to make over a little...
pinless joints.
Right? Wrong!
Well, specifically on Spider-Man, we've been getting these joint pins sticking through the elbows. All these years, you can see on this version of the Pizza Spider-Man, you just have these really big red eyesores that break the blue part of his design. Back in the Toy Biz days, these pins would have been painted blue so that they don't actually stick out too much. But Hasbro, being Hasbro, they saved a few cents by not putting in that effort to paint them. And you can see this bothered me enough that on my figures, including my retro carded Spider-Man, I was the one who put in the effort of painting those pins. But thankfully, I have to do that no more, because this new 2-pack Spider-Man not only doesn't have big ugly red pins, it doesn't have any pins showing through. It really shouldn't be that big a deal, I know. Other companies have been doing it for years. Import figures have never had that joint pin problem, but on a Hasbro Marvel Legends Spider-Man, it's a much appreciated update. Hasbro went beyond just updating the elbows and knees though. In a close comparison, you'll notice that they also updated the shoulders and hips, and of course we'll get to the feet as well. The quote-unquote new sculpt of the legs isn't too different from the Sunfire style legs. The musculature looks very similar. It really is just a pinless look, but if you go up to the hips, they look a little bit different. I kind of feel they've closed the thigh gap a little bit better, and it looks a little bit more nicely integrated into the sculpt. Where the hips meet the lower torso. But really it's all about the new shoulders, which are now bigger and closer to the body than the Sunfire shoulders of old. Them being bigger is a marked improvement over that old version, but I still can't help but feel like the shoulders are still a tad too small and still a tad too low. The torso remains the same as the retro card version of Spider-Man, so it's still not a perfect sculpt there, especially in the kind of lower area. I just think he has a flat butt that's not really comic accurate.
You're a fraud, Spider-Man!
Also, it means he has the exact same neck as the original retro Spider-Man, and we'll get to why that's a big problem later. The new paint job is quite nice, I feel. The wider web pattern, larger emblems, dark blue and bright red, and of course the new head sculpt with the big buggy eyes indicate a modern take on Spider-Man, juxtaposed to the Romita/Ditko classic-inspired original retro card version. As a big Spider-Man fan, I have room for both in my collection, but if you're the kind to crave just one definitive Spider-Man for your displays, you're going to want to ask yourself if you like a modern Spider-Man or prefer the classic look. I do like this new masked head a lot. It's very reminiscent of the original Pizza Spider-Man head, but sculpted to be bigger and sit nicer on his body. He seems to have a bit of a wider jaw, so it looks a little bit nicer on his body than if you just had head swapped the Pizza Spider-Man head on it. And I can't help but feel like Hasbro probably tried to see if they could get away with the Pizza Spider-Man head on this body, but thankfully they went the smart route and made a new head that actually does fit on it as nicely as it does. The bigger head does mean he doesn't quite come across as buff as the slightly smaller headed retro card version, but I'm kind of okay with that. Let's talk control, which is not always a fun issue to discuss when it comes to action figures, but it's important, especially with new Marvel Legends now coming in closed boxes where you can't even look at QC errors until after buying and opening the package. If you always collect figures online, this package style really doesn't matter to you, but these figures aren't online exclusives. People are buying these in stores, and it sucks buying them in person and no longer being able to see the figures in the package until you take them out. Lucky for me, the paint job on here is fairly clean. There's only one or two spots where the web lines have something hinky going on. Nothing really that major. And there is one spot or two where the red misses, but again, it's all stuff that's largely ignorable, at least on the figure's front. The back is also not too bad, except right here on the butterfly joint, where they painted this big red spider logo, and the arms are just kind of painted really poorly. Multiple paint layers, obviously not aligning like they should. Not great, but at least it's on the back, I guess. The materials of the figure also feel a little bit questionable. Overall, the joints are pretty sturdy, but there are exceptions. The hip joints have these drop-down hinges that are carried over from the retro Spider-Man, and this isn't a problem exclusive of his figure because it actually is carried over from that retro Spider-Man. That drop-down hinge feels a little bit floppy. It's a little bit loose. Not a big fan of that, but that's tolerable What I don't really like is the figure has quite gummy bicep swivels. The plastic for the shoulder is on a softer side, and it's mainly a problem on my right arm where the bicep doesn't quite plug in super flush to the shoulder like on the left, which leaves that arm at the mercy of the gumminess of the joint peg of the shoulder. You can see it kind of it's just super flimsy, and that coupled with the shoulder joint itself being relatively tight and the elbow joints being relatively tight, it makes for some really nervous posing where I kind of feel like if I'm not careful, I might tear the bicep off the shoulder. And I don't think this problem is exclusive to me. I saw at least one other person online say they had a really gummy right shoulder as well. Hopefully, if you get one of these, you won't have that problem. It's tolerable if you're just careful, it's fine, but it really does suck, especially since this problem does not exist on my copy of the retro-carded Spider-Man. That figure's biceps feel nice and sturdy and have no problem there. So there's a downgrade. I'm guessing the new shoulder design, I don't think it's something inherent with the new shoulder design. It just seems to be the materials they chose for the shoulder and how they did a kind of bad job connecting the arm to that shoulder. And that gets us talking about articulation, where this figure is mostly the same as the retro version, with some improvements and some of the same flaws. And we're immediately starting with the flaws. As I hinted earlier, he has the same torso, so he has the same abhorrent, atrocious, ghastly neck joint. When the retro card Spider-Man came out, Hasbro was trying out integrating double ball peg neck joints into their figures. The barbell style joint where the neck is a socket, you put in a peg that has a ball joint at either end, and that should get you a lot of range of motion in all directions. And this shift from the typical neck hinge to the double ball peg is actually a move that I applaud and really like the double ball peg neck joint in theory. That being said, this early attempt at it that they did with the retro Spider-Man really sucked. The design left the joint too deeply set into the body, forcing them to carve out this big ugly hole in the back of his neck to be able to get that peg moving up. It's just really gappy and it's just really ugly. You're relying more on the top ball joint than you are on the bottom ball joint of that barbell neck peg. And that's why you have all those gaps. Again, Hasbro have made better double ball pegs since then. A lot of their newer figures have maybe not necessarily perfected the joint, but have gotten to a point where they can articulate nicer without having to cut a trench in the back of the neck, where they're able to move without as much gaps. Sadly though, because this figure is not using any new parts for the neck, it's still on that older neck, we're stuck with the first poorly made attempt at that joint. But enough about necks. It does get better from there. The armpit joints at the shoulder here work just as well as they did on the Sunfire body way back when, which is to say they work really well. Though I think more effort could have been put into painting them to look good when they're actually fully used. You can see when his arms are moving back a lot, it kind of looks very bare. They could have drawn at least one more diagonal web line on either side and had the blue carry over completely. And then on the back as well, the blue just kind of stops if you extend it all the way in. The ball hinge shoulders rotate and go in and out just fine. They actually are able to go out beyond the T-pose, so that's nice. We already talked about the flimsy bicep swivels, not great. And then we get the updated pinless elbows that surprisingly have a better range of motion than the original retro Spider-Man. I can't compare the elbow range of motion to that retro Spider-Man though, because it was so bad on that original figure that I felt the need to customize it. So here it is compared to Johnny Storm instead. You can see the original elbows were stuck at like 90. This figure gets a little bit past that. So he's still not touching his shoulder or anything, but it should be enough for most Spider-Man poses. And of course, you get the standard wrist joint that rotates and hinges up and down that we've been seeing and that you expect. We get the single ball peg diaphragm joint with terrific range all around. This is the same as the retro Spider-Man. Same with the inverted ab crunch at the waist. You get good forward, good back, and of course with the diaphragm joint at the top, you can pivot him side to side and it rotates from there. And then we keep the same slightly floppy drop down hips as mentioned earlier, which allows the hips to kick up a lot. And it's very easy to also get the leg moving up and around. I really think that the drop down hip is an important feature of this figure because it really allows you to move the leg not just up but also kind of outwards for really deep crouching poses, and you're able to do that without having to scratch the hip piece against the pelvis piece. On some other Marvel Legends Spider-Man figures that don't have the drop down, you can notice that some scraping happens just because I keep trying to force the leg to go up and around for all the really dynamic Spider-Man poses, and unfortunately that does result in some damage because I'm bumping plastic together. With this figure with the drop downs, that doesn't happen, and I appreciate that. You have the thigh swivels, which break the sculpt, but they work fine. You get the double jointed knees; they work and look pretty good for a Hasbro figure. He can almost kick his butt, so that's good. The calf swivel, which like the thigh swivel, is just a straight cut, and it's even uglier when you rotate it, but at least it allows the boot to be cast in a different color plastic than the upper part of the lower leg, so I don't mind that at all. And you, of course, have the ankle hinge going up and down, pivoting side to side, and then beyond that, get the long-missed toe hinges on a Marvel Legends Spider-Man figure. These simple, somewhat floppy pieces of articulation do a lot for making a Spider-Man figure as fully posable as he should be. Paired best with the open wall-crawling hands, you're finally able to get a Hasbro Spider-Man on the tips of his fingers and the tips of his toes in a deep crouch where his feet can actually look natural, not just sort of stiff and flat-footed all the time. I'm very glad Hasbro have added this bit of old school articulation that was once standard on Toy Biz figures. It's bittersweet though, because even though Hasbro had the sense to put that articulation back into this Spider-Man figure, they are still neglecting to make it standard on Spider-Man, and a lot of their future and even the currently released Spider-Man figures with new molds are missing this articulation, including the new Amazing Fantasy Spider-Man that I know will be reused for the animated series version as well. Those don't get the toe articulation. And then the 3-pack of the No Way Home movie Spider-Man also don't have toe articulation. So it's really great that Hasbro added them here, but I don't know why it's seemingly exclusive to this figure, when it would have been really exciting if Hasbro had the sense to put this piece of articulation on all their Spider-Man figures moving forward. Anyways, at the end of the day, this figure updates a lot of good, but maintains a lot of flaws of the original retro card Spider-Man, and there's also some new flaws to boot. So is it a worthwhile update if you had that older figure? For my money, and I did spend my money, yes, it is an improved figure, and I don't regret buying this set. Thankfully, the Mary Jane figure that comes with the Spider-Man is not such a slouch. She's obviously not nearly as posable as the Spider-Man, but she still poses surprisingly well, and I really like the new head sculpts that come with the figure, and I appreciate that they gave her the same set of hands as they did Spider-Man. So it is a really nice Spinneret figure. Of course, most people will be buying this for Spider-Man, but if you are interested in Spinneret, in Mary Jane, as a Spider superhero, you can get a pretty good figure of that as part of this set. So if you don't mind paying for a good MJ figure along with it, I think the Spider-Man figure is a good purchase if you're a massive Spider-Man fan. Ultimately, it's obviously up to you if you want to cough up the price for this set. $55 is not exactly a small amount of money. Hopefully I went over the good and the bad in a thorough enough way that it helps you make a more informed decision of how you spend your money. So comment your thoughts on the figure below. Do you have it? Do you like it? Do you regret buying it? Is this a good enough update of the retro card Spider-Man, or do you wish it was better? Any thoughts you have on the figure on this set, leave it below. Leave a like. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in my next video.